Everyone at Oak Ridge Commons had stopped eating. Even the children were silent. I stood near the picnic tables, still holding the glass tray of my homemade peach cobbler, as Melody's voice sliced through the air. "You weren't even invited, Judith. No one wants a nosy old bat snooping around this potluck." Her words hung in the air like a thunderclap. I could feel dozens of eyes on me. Some curious, others embarrassed, a few even gleeful. The annual community potluck, usually filled with cheerful chatter and the sounds of children playing, had transformed into a silent tableau of shock and discomfort. My hands trembled slightly beneath the weight of my peach cobbler, my mother's recipe, the one thing I'd spent all morning perfecting. At 72, my arthritic fingers had painstakingly peeled each peach, mixed the perfect amount of cinnamon and brown sugar, and created the flaky crust that Harold had always loved. Harold. My late husband would have known exactly what to say in this moment. But he wasn't here anymore. It had been just over a year since I'd lost him, and this potluck was my first real attempt at rejoining community life. I blinked slowly, trying to will away the burning sensation behind my eyes. Melody Carson stood there in her designer sundress, her perfectly highlighted blonde hair gleaming in the summer sun, arms crossed over her chest like she was the gatekeeper of this community gathering. At 55, she'd appointed herself the unofficial queen of Oak Ridge Commons, and for the past year, I'd been her favorite target. I brought peach cobbler, I said softly, the words sounding pathetic even to my own ears. Melody laughed, the sound brittle and sharp. "We already have desserts, Judith. Beverly made cobbler too, and hers doesn't look like it came from the senior center's leftover bin." A few nervous titters rippled through the crowd. I saw Beverly shift uncomfortably near the dessert table, her eyes darting between her. Cobbler and mine. She didn't speak up. No one did. These were my neighbors. People I'd known for decades. I'd been the town librarian for 35 years before retiring. I'd read to their children, helped with research projects, recommended books for their vacations. Yet in this moment, they were strangers, unwilling to step into the uncomfortable space Melody had created. I could have turned around, could have taken my cobbler and my dignity, and walked the 3 blocks back to my empty house, could have closed the door, drawn the curtains, and cried into Harold's pillow that still faintly smelled like him. Instead, I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It wasn't even a defiant one. It was the kind of smile that comes when you've been knocked down so many times that you suddenly realize the ground isn't such a terrible place to be. "You're right, Melody," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Perhaps there are too many desserts." I walked past her, ignoring the way she stepped back as if my presence might contaminate her. I moved through the crowd, which parted like the Red Sea, until I reached the small stage where the microphone stood. Beverly was about to begin the community announcements, but she hesitated when she saw me approaching. "May I?" I asked, gesturing to the microphone. Beverly nodded, confusion evident on her face. I carefully set my cobbler on the edge of the stage and stepped up to the microphone. "Good afternoon, everyone," I said, my voice carrying across the park. "I'd like to thank you all for coming together today. Community is important, isn't it? It's what sustains us through difficult times." I paused, looking out at the sea of faces. Some looked concerned, others curious. Melody stood with her arms still crossed, a smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. "As many of you know, I lost my Harold last year. He loved this community. We moved here 43 years ago, when Oak Ridge Commons was just being built. We raised our daughter Amanda here. We volunteered, we contributed, we cared." I took a deep breath, feeling a strange calm settle over me. Harold was always the planner between us, the visionary, and before he passed, he made an investment that recently matured. He wanted to ensure that this community would continue to thrive for generations to come. The murmuring began, a gentle ripple of whispers. "So, today I'd like to announce that I am donating $250,000 to the Oak Ridge Commons Community Fund." The whispers exploded into gasps. Melody's face went slack with shock. "This money is to be used specifically for building a new playground for our children and creating an accessible garden space for our seniors. The only condition I have—" I paused, letting the moment stretch. "Is that Melody?" Carson stepped down from the Community Events Committee, effective immediately. The silence was electric. Melody's face had drained of all color. I watched as the cobbler she'd made, placed prominently at the center of the dessert table, slowly slid right off the table's edge, landing with a splat on the grass. the perfect metaphor for her pride. I've brought documentation of the donation, as well as some concerning financial records from the HOA that I think everyone should see, I continued, pulling a folder from my large handbag. But first, I think I'll have some lunch. I'm famished. Thank you. I stepped away from the microphone, picked up my cobbler, and walked to an empty table. Within seconds, Amanda's childhood friend Ellie was sitting beside me, then Greg from the local newspaper, then the Thompsons from 2 doors down. As I cut into my cobbler, serving each of them a piece, I caught Melody's eye across the park. She stood alone now, her friends having dispersed to process this new development. I lifted my fork in a small toast and took the first bite of my mother's peach cobbler. It tasted like victory. Let me take you back to where this story truly begins. It was a Tuesday morning, raining softly when Harold died. Not dramatically, not unexpectedly, just quietly slipped away in his sleep after 18 months of battling cancer. I'd fallen asleep holding his hand and woke up still holding it, though it had grown cold. That's how death often is. No crescendo of music, no dramatic last words, just the quiet absence of breath, of warmth, of life. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, casseroles delivered by well-meaning neighbors, and paperwork. Endless paperwork that comes with unraveling a life shared for 46 years. Amanda flew in from Seattle with her husband and children, stayed for 2 weeks, then had to return to their lives. Mom, you should come back with us, Amanda had urged, her eyes filled with concern as she packed her suitcase. The guest room is all yours. The kids would love having Grandma around. But I couldn't leave, not yet. This house held Harold in every corner, his reading glasses still on the nightstand, his gardening boots by the back door, his favorite mug in the dish drainer. Leaving felt like abandoning him all over again. I'll be fine, I assured her. I have my books, my garden. The neighbors check in. That last part wasn't entirely true. In the first month after Harold's passing, there had been casseroles and sympathy cards, brief visits and promises to get together soon. But as spring melted into summer, those visits dwindled. I didn't blame them. Grief is uncomfortable for the witnesses, except for Melody Carson. She didn't avoid me because of grief. She avoided me because she'd never liked me to begin with. Our history stretched back decades. When Melody and her husband Paul moved to Oak Ridge Commons 15 years ago, she'd immediately set about positioning herself as the social director of the neighborhood. She was younger, more energetic, with an assertive personality that many found refreshing after years of the more traditional community leadership. But Harold and I represented the old guard. As the longtime town librarian, I had deep connections throughout the community. People respected Harold's quiet wisdom as a retired high school principal. We weren't flashy, but we were fixtures. Melody's attempts to edge us out of community influence had been subtle at first, forgetting to include us on email chains for planning, meetings, scheduling events when she knew we had prior commitments. But after Harold's diagnosis, when we naturally withdrew from community involvement to focus on his treatment, she seized the opportunity to completely reshape the neighborhood's social structure. By the time Harold passed away, Melody had consolidated her power. She'd become head of the HOA events committee, controlled the community newsletter, and had established a tight inner circle of neighbors who followed her lead. I noticed it all, of course. The librarian in me had always been observant, but I had bigger concerns at the time. 3 months after Harold's funeral, I received my first direct slight from Melody. It was the annual 4th of July block party, an event Harold and I had helped establish 20 years earlier. I'd baked my traditional apple pie and walked over to the community center, only to find my name wasn't on the contribution list. "Oh, Judith," Melody had said with exaggerated surprise when I arrived. "We didn't think you'd be up for joining us. You know, with everything." She left the sentence hanging, as if my grief were contagious. "I've never missed a community 4th of July, I said simply, placing my pie on the table. "Well, we've made some changes this year, modernized things a bit," she replied, moving my pie to a less prominent position. "The younger families prefer cupcakes and those fancy cake pops now." It was a small slight, but it stung. That night I watched the fireworks alone from my back porch instead of joining the community gathering. As summer faded into fall, the pattern continued. My name accidentally left off the book club email list. My gardening column quietly removed from the community newsletter. My offers to volunteer at the Halloween carnival politely but firmly declined. "We're trying to create a more vibrant, forward-thinking community image," Melody explained when I confronted her about the gardening column. Your traditional approach doesn't quite fit our new direction. Traditional. The word hung in the air between us, loaded with meaning. Old, outdated, irrelevant. I retreated further into my solitude. My world shrank to my house, my garden, weekly calls with Amanda, and occasional lunches with my old colleagues from the library. I watched from behind my curtains as Melody hosted lavish barbecues, organized wine, tastings, and led power walking groups through the neighborhood, activities that seemed designed to exclude those of us over 65. Then came the HOA letter that changed everything. Due to recent community improvements and updated facilities, there will be a special assessment of $1,100 per household to cover expenses already incurred. The improvements included a completely unnecessary renovation of the tennis courts, used primarily by Melody's circle, new Italian marble countertops for the community center kitchen, and landscaping that replaced sustainable native plants with water-hungry ornamentals that matched the color scheme of Melody's home. For me, living on a fixed income, $1,200 was significant. For several of the older residents in the community, it was devastating. That evening, I sat in Harold's study, surrounded by his books and the lingering scent of his pipe tobacco. I opened his desk drawer and pulled out the leather-bound community charter that he'd helped draft decades ago. The purpose of Oak Ridge Commons, it read, is to create an inclusive, supportive environment where residents of all ages and backgrounds can thrive together. I ran my fingers over Harold's handwriting in the margins, notes he'd made about ensuring the community remained affordable for retirees, accessible for those with disabilities, and welcoming to families with young children. Melody's vision for Oak Ridge Commons was the antithesis of everything Harold had worked for. I closed the charter and looked up at Harold's photograph on the desk. His kind eyes seemed to be asking a question. "What would you do?" I whispered to his image. And in that moment, I knew. Harold wouldn't have sunk into isolation. He wouldn't have accepted defeat. He would have stood up, not just for himself, but for everyone being pushed aside. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in months. I put on proper clothes, applied lipstick, and walked out my front door with purpose. It was time to reclaim my place in this community. My first step toward reclaiming my place wasn't dramatic or confrontational. I simply began showing up again. I attended the monthly HOA meeting that Thursday evening, slipping into a seat in the back row of the community center. Several people did double takes when they saw me. Judith Patterson, emerging from her self-imposed exile. I nodded, politely but said nothing, just observed. Melody, presiding at the front table with her cohorts, faltered briefly when she spotted me, but quickly recovered. As I was saying, she continued, flipping her blonde hair over her shoulder, the new landscaping has received numerous compliments from visitors. Property values are already seeing the benefit. I listened as she and her committee rattled off expenditures that had little to do with actual community needs. Designer benches for the community center foyer, a state-of-the-art coffee machine for the clubhouse, plans for a signature fountain at the neighborhood entrance. When the financial report was presented, I carefully noted the numbers in a small notebook I'd brought. No one challenged the figures, though I noticed several of my fellow seniors shifting uncomfortably when the special assessment was mentioned again. "Any questions?" Melody asked perfunctorily at the end, clearly not expecting any. I raised my hand. The room went silent. "Yes, Judith?" Melody said, her tone suggesting she was granting a great favor by acknowledging me. "I was wondering if we might see an itemized breakdown of the tennis court renovation. Costs? The summary seems quite general." Melody's smile tightened. "Those details are available to committee members, Judith, but I assure you, everything was competitively bid." "I see. And might I ask who handled the bidding process?" A slight flush crept up Melody's neck. "My husband's construction management firm oversaw the process, as they've graciously donated their services to the community." I nodded, made a note, and said nothing more. But I'd confirmed what I suspected. Paul Carson's company was profiting from these community improvements. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me cautiously. "Good to see you out again, Judith," said George Henderson, a retired accountant who'd lived in Oak Ridge Commons almost as long as I had. "It's been too long," I agreed. "These assessments are hitting some of us hard," he murmured, glancing around to ensure Melody wasn't within earshot. "Esther Williams down on Maple Drive is talking about having to sell. She can't manage the extra expense on her Social Security." "That's concerning," I said. Perhaps we should look more closely at the HOA finances. Good luck with that, George replied with a wry smile. Melody guards those records like state secrets. But what Melody didn't know was that I had spent 35 years as a librarian. Research wasn't just my profession, it was my superpower. The next morning, I called Greg Sullivan, editor of the local newspaper and a former library regular who'd relied on my research skills for countless stories over the years. Judith, what a pleasant surprise, he said. When I reached him, how are you holding up? I'm ready to rejoin the land of the living, I told him, and I could use your help with something. We met for coffee that afternoon. Greg, with his salt and pepper beard and perpetually rumpled appearance, listened intently as I explained my concerns about the HOA finances. Public records, he nodded thoughtfully when I finished. Construction, permits, business filings, tax records, they're all accessible if you know where to look, and between the two of us, we certainly do. Over the next few weeks, Greg and I pieced together a troubling pattern. Paul Carson's construction management company had indeed overseen all the recent renovations, and while they hadn't directly performed the work, they had steered contracts to companies with connections to the Carsons, a landscaping firm owned by Melody's brother, a design consultant who was her college roommate, a furniture supplier who was Paul's golf buddy. Nothing explicitly illegal, but certainly ethically questionable, especially since none of these relationships had been disclosed to the community. Meanwhile, I began quietly reconnecting with neighbors, not Melody's inner circle, but others. The elderly couple on the corner who'd stopped attending events because they felt unwelcome, the young single mother who couldn't afford the extravagant Christmas party gift exchange Melody had instituted, the middle-aged man caring for his disabled brother who found the new landscaping had eliminated accessible pathways. I didn't speak against Melody. I simply listened to their concerns, shared cups of tea, offered rides to appointments, babysat occasionally for the single mother. Small gestures that began weaving a different kind of community fabric than the one Melody was creating. The children's corner at the community center had been neglected as funding went to adult-centered amenities. One Saturday morning, I arrived with a box of books from my personal collection and began organizing a small lending library. Several children who remembered me from my days as town librarian gravitated toward me as I arranged the books. "Would you read to us, Mrs. Patterson?" asked little Emma Thompson, her front tooth missing and her eyes hopeful. Soon I had 5 children gathered around as I read Charlotte's Web, doing all the different voices as I had for decades at the town library's story hour. I was so engrossed that I didn't notice Melody enter until I heard her sharp voice. "Children, your parents are looking for you. The swimming demonstration is about to begin at the pool." The children reluctantly dispersed, and Melody turned her attention to me. "This isn't an authorized activity, Judith," she said, gesturing to the books. "The community center schedule is planned months in advance." "It's just a few books," I replied mildly. The children seemed to enjoy them. "We're trying to promote active lifestyles, not turn the community center into a dusty old library." Her words were deliberately chosen to wound. I simply smiled. "Well, we need both, don't we? Bodies and minds." Melody's eyes narrowed. "I'll need to remove these books. They haven't been approved by the activities committee." "Of course," I said, beginning to pack them up. "Though I'm curious, when did children's books become something requiring committee approval?" Melody didn't answer, just watched as I gathered my belongings. As I was leaving, I turned back. "By the way, I've been meaning to ask, how did your husband's company determine that Italian marble art was the most cost-effective option for the community kitchen countertops?" Her face registered shock, then suspicion. "That's committee business, Judith. If you're so interested in how things are run, perhaps you should volunteer for a committee instead of criticizing from the sidelines." "What an excellent suggestion," I replied. "I believe I will." The following week, I submitted my application to join the Budget Oversight Committee. It was promptly rejected due to lack of relevant experience, a laughable excuse given my years managing the town library's budget, but I hadn't expected to be accepted. I merely wanted documentation of the rejection for the file I was building. That evening, I received a phone call from my daughter. "Mom, are you sitting down?" Amanda asked, her voice vibrating with excitement. "I am now," I said, settling into Harold's old armchair. "What's happening?" "Dad's investment in that tech startup, the one everyone thought was a long shot, they just got acquired by Microsoft. Your shares are worth—" "Mom, it's a lot of money." I listened in stunned silence as Amanda explained the details. Harold had invested a modest amount in a former student's company years ago, taking shares instead of repayment for a loan. We'd written it off as Harold's way of supporting a bright young mind, never expecting any return. Now that forgotten investment had matured into a small fortune. Around $300,000 after taxes, Amanda concluded. Mom, you could move to Seattle, buy a condo near us. You wouldn't have to worry about money. Again, I gazed at Harold's photograph on the mantel, his kind eyes seeming to twinkle with amusement at this final surprise he'd arranged. No, I said slowly, an idea taking shape. I don't think I'll be moving just yet. I have something important to finish here first. As I hung up the phone, I knew exactly what Harold would have wanted me to do with this unexpected windfall, and it wasn't what Melody Carson would ever see coming. The letter arrived on crisp HOA stationery, Melody's looping signature at the bottom. Dear resident, you are cordially invited to the Oak Ridge Commons annual community potluck to be held Saturday, June 15th at the community park. This cherished tradition brings together residents to celebrate our vibrant community spirit. Please bring a dish to share that. Reflects your personal heritage or specialty. RSVP required for planning purposes. I held the invitation, tracing my finger over the embossed Oak Ridge Commons logo. For the first time in months, I'd received an official community invitation. Not because Melody had suddenly developed an appreciation for my company, I was certain, but because the community potluck had always been an all-inclusive event. To exclude a longtime resident would be too obvious, too petty even for Melody. What she didn't know was how perfectly her timing aligned with my plans. The day after learning about Harold's investment, I'd visited my attorney, Margaret Chen, a formidable woman who had been handling our legal affairs for decades. A charitable foundation? Margaret had asked, her eyebrows rising slightly, as I outlined my intentions. Not exactly, I explained. More of a targeted community investment. I want to donate the majority of this money to Oak Ridge Commons, but with very specific conditions. For the next hour, we had discussed the legal framework for such a donation, the enforceability of conditions, and the documentation required. By the end of our meeting, Margaret was smiling. Harold would be proud, she said, gathering the notes we'd made. This is exactly the kind of thoughtful community stewardship he always valued. In the weeks leading up to the potluck, I continued my quiet community reconnaissance. I attended every public HOA meeting, though I rarely spoke. I volunteered at the community garden, gently suggesting ways to make it more accessible for senior residents. I resumed my Sunday afternoon walks through the neighborhood, stopping to chat with neighbors tending their yards. All the while, I was building relationships and gathering information. Not in a calculating way, but in the manner of someone rediscovering their place in a community that had changed during their absence. Greg Sullivan continued his research into the HOA finances, occasionally dropping by with new findings. Paul Carson's company took a 15% management fee for the tennis court renovation, he reported during one such visit. Industry standard is 8 to 10%. And guess who sits on the board of the bank that holds the HOA's accounts? None other than Melody herself. I added these details to our growing dossier, not with malice, but with methodical precision. This wasn't about revenge. It was about transparency and accountability. The morning of the potluck, I rose early. Through my kitchen window, I could see volunteers setting up tables in the park across the street. Melody was there, directing the placement of each table with imperious gestures, her voice occasionally carrying on the morning breeze. I turned my attention to my mother's peach cobbler recipe, faded and stained, from decades of use. Harold had loved this dessert, claiming it was better than anything from the finest restaurants in the city. I hadn't made it since before his illness. As I peeled the ripe peaches, their sweet scent filled my kitchen, bringing with it a flood of memories. Summer evenings on the porch with Harold, Amanda as a child with peach juice dripping down her chin, family gatherings, where this cobbler was always the most requested dessert. For the first time in months, these memories brought more comfort than pain. I was doing this not just for myself, but for Harold's legacy and for the community he had loved. By mid-afternoon, my cobbler was cooling on the counter, its golden crust perfect, the sweet tart aroma of peaches and cinnamon filling the house. I dressed carefully, in a light blue sundress that Harold had always complimented, applied a touch of lipstick, and placed my mother's antique serving knife beside the cobbler in my carrying tray. In my large handbag, I placed the folder containing the donation documents Margaret had prepared, along with the research Greg and I had compiled on the HOA's financial irregularities. Everything was in order. Before Leaving, I paused at the hallway mirror, studying my reflection. At 72, my face mapped the journey of my life, laugh lines around my eyes from years of joy, a certain gravity around my mouth from recent grief. My silver hair was neatly styled, my posture straight, despite the arthritis that sometimes troubled my back. "Well, Harold," I said softly to the empty house, "let's go set things." Right! Across the street, the potluck was in full swing. Children raced around the playground equipment, their laughter carrying on the summer breeze. Adults clustered around tables laden with food, the air filled with the mingling aromas of dozens of different dishes. As I approached the entrance to the park, glass tray carefully balanced in my hands, I spotted Melody holding court near the welcome table, surrounded by her usual admirers. She wore a designer sundress in a vibrant coral that made my simple blue dress seem faded by comparison. Our eyes met across the expanse of green grass. Something flickered across her face. Surprise? Annoyance? Perhaps a touch of satisfaction at the confrontation to come. I took a deep breath and continued forward, smiling pleasantly at neighbors who noticed my arrival. Some nodded in greeting, others seemed surprised to see me. A few quickly averted their eyes, as if fearing association with me might displease Melody. I was 3 steps from the food tables when Melody moved to intercept me, her coral dress bright as a warning flag in the afternoon sun. "Judith," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quieting conversations nearby. "What are you doing here?" I held up my cobbler tray with a small smile. "I brought dessert. It's my mother's peach cobbler recipe." Melody's perfectly lined lips curved into what might have appeared to be a smile to someone who didn't know better. "You weren't even invited, Judith," she said, her voice rising with each word. "No one wants a nosy old bat snooping around this potluck." And that's when everything stopped. The conversations, the children's play, even the birds seemed to pause their songs. Every eye in Oak Ridge Commons turned toward us, witnessing the moment that would change everything. I wish I could tell you that I had some grand, prepared speech ready for that moment, that I'd anticipated Melody's public humiliation and crafted the perfect cutting response. But the truth is, I was taken aback by the raw cruelty of her words, spoken so loudly that even the children at the far end of the park had fallen silent. For a heartbeat, I was transported back to my childhood, 10 years old, overlooked for a birthday party invitation, standing alone on the playground while the popular girls laughed. That same hollow feeling expanded in my chest. But I wasn't 10 anymore. I was 72, with decades of life behind me. I had buried my husband, raised a daughter, helped countless community members find knowledge and solace in books. I had earned my place in this community, so I didn't react to the hurt. Instead, I found myself thinking of Harold, what he would do in this moment, not with anger or retaliation, but with dignity and purpose. I smiled, not a sad smile or an angry smile, but the serene smile of someone who knows exactly what needs to be done. Without a word to Melody, I walked past her, my cobbler still steady in my hands. The crowd parted unconsciously, creating a path to the stage where Beverly Michaels, the official head of the community committee, was preparing to make the day's announcements. "May I?" I asked Beverly, quietly, nodding toward the microphone. Beverly, a kind woman in her 60s who had always been friendly but never quite brave enough to stand against Melody's influence, hesitated only briefly before stepping aside. "Of course, Judith," she murmured, curiosity evident in her eyes. I set my cobbler carefully on a small table at the edge of the stage and stepped up to the microphone, looking out. Over the gathered residents of Oak Ridge Commons, my neighbors for over 4 decades, I felt a strange calm descend. "Good afternoon, everyone," I began, my voice carrying clearly across the park. "For those who might not know me, I'm Judith Patterson. My husband Harold and I were among the first families to move into Oak Ridge Commons, back when most of these trees were just saplings." I paused, letting my gaze move across the familiar faces. Some looked embarrassed, others curious. Melody stood frozen near the food tables, her expression a mixture of annoyance and confusion. Community has always been at the heart of Oak Ridge Commons. Not just the buildings or the amenities, but the people, the connections we forge, the support we offer one another in times of need, the way we come together to create something greater than any one of us could achieve alone. I reached into my handbag and withdrew the folder. When Harold passed away last year, I withdrew from this community. That was my mistake, because while I was grieving in private, I allowed something precious to begin slipping away. the inclusive, supportive spirit that Harold and so many others worked to build here. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I noticed George Henderson nodding thoughtfully, and several of the older residents leaning forward to hear better. Recently, I received some unexpected news. An investment Harold made years ago has matured significantly. He couldn't have known this would happen, but I know exactly what he would have wanted done with these funds. I opened the folder and held up the official document Margaret had prepared. Today, I am donating $250,000 to the Oak Ridge Commons Community Fund, with specific allocations: $150,000 for a state-of-the-art, accessible playground that all our children can enjoy regardless of ability, $75,000 for a senior-friendly garden space with raised beds, shade structures, and seating areas, and $25,000 for a community library corner in the ETI clubhouse, stocked with books for all ages. The gasps were audible. Even Beverly, standing to the side of the stage, brought her hand to her mouth in shock. This donation comes with only 2 conditions, I continued, my voice steady. First, that an independent financial oversight committee be established to ensure transparency in all HOA expenditures going forward. I paused, my eyes finding Melody in the crowd. Her face had drained of color, her usual confidence visibly shaken. And second, that Melody Carson stepped down from the Community Events Committee, effective immediately. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, from somewhere in the back, a single person began to applaud. Others joined, the sound swelling until nearly the entire gathering was clapping, not in celebration of Melody's downfall, but in recognition of something larger, a community reclaiming its values. I held up my hand, and the applause gradually subsided. I have one more thing to share, I said, withdrawing the second folder from my bag. With the help of some concerned residents, I've compiled documentation regarding certain financial irregularities in recent HOA expenditures. Nothing overtly illegal, perhaps, but certainly concerning enough to warrant review. I handed the folder to Beverly, whose eyes widened as she glanced at the contents. I suggest the board review these findings immediately and take appropriate action. Copies have been provided to all board members and, as a matter of public record, to our local newspaper. Greg Sullivan, standing near the back, raised his coffee cup in a small salute. Now, I said, smiling warmly, I believe this is a potluck, and I've brought my mother's peach cobbler. I'd love to share it with anyone who'd care for a piece. I stepped away from the microphone, picked up my cobbler, and walked to an empty table. For a moment, I sat alone. Then George Henderson joined me, followed by the Thompsons, then Esther Williams from Maple Drive. And soon my table was full, with others pulling chairs from nearby to join our circle. Across the park, I could see Melody standing alone, her husband Paul having been quickly pulled aside by several board members. As our eyes met, I raised my fork in a small, private gesture, not of triumph, but of finality. This chapter of Oak Ridge Commons was closing, and a new one beginning. Later, as the sun began to set and the potluck wound down, Beverly approached me, the donation documents in her hand. The board has convened an emergency session and unanimously accepted your donation and conditions, she said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. Melody has resigned from all committee positions. I nodded, unsurprised. And the financial review? Beverly's expression turned serious. That will take more time, but I promise you, Judith, we will address every concern thoroughly. There will be full transparency moving forward. She hesitated, then added more softly, I should have spoken up sooner. Many of us should have. I'm sorry. I took her hand in mine. It's never too late to do the right thing, Beverly. That's what Harold always said. As I walked home that evening, the setting sun painting Oak Ridge Commons in soft golden light, I felt Harold's presence beside me more strongly than I had since his passing. Not in some mystical sense, but in the continuation of values we had shared, in the community we had helped build, in the legacy that would now continue. The cobbler plate was empty, but my heart was full. The Monday morning after the potluck, I woke to the sound of my doorbell. When I opened the front door, I found a small bouquet of daisies, my favorite flower, though few people knew that, with a handwritten note, "Thank you for your courage, the Hendersons." It was the first of many such gestures over the coming days. A loaf of homemade bread from the Williamses, a thank you card signed by several families with young children, a pot of tea, and conversation with neighbors who had rarely spoken to me before. But the most surprising visitor came on Wednesday afternoon. I was in the backyard, tending to Harold's vegetable garden, something I'd neglected during my period of grief but had recently reclaimed, when I heard the garden gate open. Looking up, I saw Paul Carson, Melody's husband, standing awkwardly at the entrance to my garden, his normally confident demeanor subdued. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, removing his sunglasses. "I hope I'm not intruding." I straightened up, brushing soil from my gardening gloves. "Not at all, Paul. Would you like some iced tea?" He seemed surprised by the offer, but nodded. I led him to the patio set Harold had built years ago, poured 2 glasses of tea from the pitcher I kept refrigerated, and waited. Paul took a long sip before speaking. "I've come to apologize," he said finally, setting down his glass, "for my role in the irregularities with the HOA finances, and for not stepping in when Melody was, well, when she was being unkind to you and others." I studied him carefully. Paul had always been the quieter half of the Carson partnership, a successful businessman who seemed content to let Melody handle their social affairs. "Why did you allow it?" I asked simply. He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "It's complicated. Melody has always been driven. When we moved here, she wanted to make her mark, to be important in a way she hadn't been able to in our previous community. I supported that initially. And the financial arrangements?" Paul had the grace to look ashamed. "It started small. A recommendation here, a connection there. Then it became expected. The lines blurred. I justified it as helping the community while also helping our friends' businesses." He paused. "But it wasn't right, and I knew it." I nodded, appreciating his honesty. "And now? We've resigned from all committees. I've returned the management fees my company took, above industry standard. And he hesitated. "We're considering selling our house and moving. Melody feels she can't stay here after everything." Something in his expression, a mixture of resignation and relief, told me this decision wasn't entirely unwelcome to him. "That's your choice to make," I said. "But running away doesn't solve problems, it just relocates them." Paul nodded, slowly. "You sound like your husband. He once told me something similar when I was considering changing companies during a difficult period. He was a wise man." "Yes," I agreed, smiling at the memory. "He was." We sat in surprisingly comfortable silence for a moment, sipping our tea as bees buzzed among the flowering herbs in my garden. "What will happen with the playground?" Paul asked. "Eventually. I'd like to offer my company's services, at cost, no management fee, if the community would accept it." I considered his offer. "That's not my decision to make, Paul, but I think gestures of reconciliation are rarely rejected by those with open hearts." After Paul left, I sat in the garden a while longer, thinking about forgiveness and redemption. Melody might never apologize. Some people find that impossibly difficult, but perhaps her husband's gesture was a start toward healing for their family and for the community. The next few weeks brought rapid changes to Oak Ridge Commons. The emergency board meeting following the potluck had resulted in a complete reorganization of the HOA leadership. Beverly was elected as the new president, with George Henderson as treasurer and a diverse group of residents, young families, seniors, and longtime homeowners, filling the remaining positions. True to her word, Beverly initiated a thorough review of the HOA finances with complete transparency. Weekly updates were posted in the community center and emailed to all residents. While some financial decisions couldn't be undone, policies were established to prevent similar issues. In the future, competitive bidding requirements, conflict of interest disclosures, and regular independent audits. The Playground Planning Committee was formed, with representatives from each age group in the community. To my surprise, I was asked to chair the committee. "We need someone who understands the importance of inclusivity," Beverly explained when she extended the invitation. "Someone who remembers what Oak Ridge Commons was meant to be." I accepted, on the condition that we include children in the planning process. "After all," I pointed out, "they're the real experts on what makes a great playground." And so began a series of design workshops, where children of all ages drew their dream playground features, while adults discussed practical considerations of safety, accessibility, and maintenance. The enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself energized by the creative chaos of these gatherings. Through it all, I watched the community transform. Neighbors who had previously only exchanged perfunctory greetings were lingering to chat after meetings. Spontaneous potlucks sprang up on weekend evenings. A group of teenagers volunteered to help seniors with technology challenges. The boundaries Melody had so carefully constructed between old and young, established residents and newcomers began to dissolve. One evening, as I was returning from a playground committee meeting, I noticed an unfamiliar car in my driveway. As I approached, the driver's door opened, and my daughter Amanda stepped out. "Surprise!" she called, opening her arms for a hug. "Amanda, what are you doing here?" I embraced her, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. "I came to see this community revolution I've been hearing about," she said, pulling back to look at me with a mixture of pride and wonder. "Mom, you're all over the local paper's website. Greg Sullivan has written 3 articles about the renaissance of Oak Ridge Commons. You're practically a celebrity." I laughed, leading her inside. "Hardly. I just reminded people of what we already knew but had forgotten." Amanda shook her head as she followed me into the kitchen. "Don't downplay it. You stood up to a bully and inspired an entire community to reclaim itself. That's amazing." I busied myself making tea, oddly embarrassed by her praise. "How long can you stay?" "Just the weekend. But I wanted to see you in person, not just on video calls. You seem different, more alive." I considered her observation as I set out cups and saucers, Harold's favorite set, which I'd kept in the cabinet untouched for months after his death. "I feel more alive," I admitted. "After your father died, I felt like I was just waiting, not living, just existing. But now you have purpose again," Amanda finished for me. "More than that," I said, sitting across from her at the kitchen table. "I have community again, and I've realized that was what I was really missing all along." The Saturday morning of Amanda's visit dawned bright and clear. We were enjoying coffee on the back patio when my phone rang. Beverly, calling with news that couldn't wait. "Judith, you won't believe this," she said, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Paul Carson just called. He's secured matching funds for the playground from his business associates. Another $150,000. I nearly spilled my coffee. "That's unexpected. He said it was important to him to make amends in a concrete way," Beverly continued. "And there's more. He's offered to cover the costs of a professional playground designer who specializes in accessible equipment, a woman who's won awards for her inclusive designs." After thanking Beverly and ending the call, I shared the news with Amanda, who looked both impressed and suspicious. "Do you trust this?" she asked, ever the protective daughter. "After everything his wife did?" I considered the question carefully. "I think Paul is sincere. He's always been overshadowed by Melody. Perhaps this is his way of finding his own voice." Amanda shook her head in amazement. "You're something else, Mom. Most people would still be holding a grudge." "Grudges are heavy things to carry," I replied, thinking of Harold's favorite saying. "And at my age, I'm trying to travel light." That afternoon, Amanda accompanied me to the community center where the playground committee was scheduled to review the children's design ideas. The room was buzzing with energy as children proudly displayed their crayon renderings of dream play spaces, parents chatted animatedly, and seniors offered perspectives on what had worked in playgrounds of decades past. When Paul Carson entered the room, a momentary hush fell over the gathering. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, a portfolio tucked under his arm, uncertainty written across his face. I crossed the room to greet him. "Paul, thank you for coming," I said, loud enough for others to hear. "Beverly told me about your generous offer." Relief flooded his features. "I've brought some preliminary sketches from the designer I mentioned," he said, holding up the portfolio. "Just ideas to get started." I led him to the central table where the committee had gathered. "Everyone, I believe you know Paul Carson. He's brought some professional design concepts for us to consider alongside our community ideas." The reception was cool, but civil. George Henderson, ever the practical accountant, immediately asked, "What's the catch with this matching funds offer?" Paul met his gaze directly. "No catch, George. No strings attached. The money goes to the community fund, and the community decides how to use it. I've already transferred it this morning." Gradually, as Paul opened his portfolio and began sharing the designer's vision, which incorporated many elements the children had suggested, but with professional safety considerations, the atmosphere warmed. When he mentioned adding features specifically designed for children with mobility challenges, Emma Thompson's mother, whose younger son used a wheelchair, actually teared up. "No one ever thinks about kids like Theo when they design playgrounds," she said softly. "They should," Paul replied simply. "Every child deserves to play." By the end of the meeting, Paul had been fully integrated into the discussion, contributing ideas but never dominating. I watched him with growing respect, seeing a different man than the one who had stood silently by his wife's side at countless community events. As people were gathering their things to leave, Paul approached me, Amanda hovering protectively nearby. "Judith, there's something else I wanted to mention," he said, his voice lowered. "Melody and I have decided not to sell the house after all." I raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Oh? It was my decision, actually," he admitted. "Running away felt cowardly, and I told Melody that if we move, we'll just repeat the same pattern somewhere else. Better to face things here and grow from it." "That can't have been an easy conversation," I observed. Paul smiled ruefully. "It wasn't, but necessary. She's struggling. Her whole identity was wrapped up in her position here. She's seeing a therapist now, trying to understand why she felt so compelled to control everything, to exclude people who should have been valued. I hope she finds her answers," I said sincerely. "She asked me to tell you." Paul hesitated. "She's not ready to apologize in person yet, but she wants you to know she's sorry for how she treated you, especially after Harold passed." I nodded, acknowledging the message without commenting on its adequacy. Some wounds take longer to heal, and some people need more time to find their better selves. As Paul left, Amanda linked her arm through mine. "You know what I just realized? You're the most influential person in Oak Ridge Commons now. Everyone looks to you for approval, for direction." The Aiwa observation startled me. "That wasn't my intention." "I know," Amanda said, squeezing my arm affectionately. "That's why they trust you. You never wanted power, you just wanted community." The truth of her words settled over me as we walked home. I had never sought influence, but in standing up for what was right, I had somehow become a quiet leader in the community. It was a responsibility I hadn't anticipated, but one I now recognized I needed to handle with care. Sunday evening came too quickly, and soon I was hugging Amanda goodbye at the front door. "I'm so proud of you, Mom," she said, holding me tight. "Dad would be too." As I watched her car disappear down the street, I felt a familiar pang of loneliness, but it was different now, a gentle acknowledgement of missing a loved one, rather than the crushing isolation I'd experienced after Harold's death. Monday morning brought another meeting, this time with Greg Sullivan, to discuss an upcoming feature in the local paper about the community's transformation. "I'm thinking of calling it the Cobbler Revolution," Greg said with a grin as we sat in his cluttered office at the newspaper. "Has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" I groaned. "Please don't. This isn't about me, Greg." "But it started with you," he insisted. "That moment at the potluck, it was the catalyst for everything that's followed." "It could have been anyone," I argued. "Someone just needed to speak up." Greg leaned back in his chair, studying me thoughtfully. "But it wasn't anyone. It was you, Judith Patterson, who lost her husband and withdrew from community life, then came back stronger than ever. That's the story people connect with." I sighed, recognizing the determination in his expression. "At least keep the focus on what the community is achieving together. The playground, the garden spaces, the return to inclusive values." "Deal," Greg agreed, making notes, though I'm still using Cobbler Revolution as the headline. As summer progressed into early fall, the playground project moved from planning to reality. The old equipment was removed, the ground prepared, and foundation work begun. Children gathered daily to watch the construction progress, their excitement growing as swings, slides, and climbing structures took shape. Paul Carson was true to his word, overseeing the project with meticulous attention to detail, but no management fee. More surprisingly, his wife Melody began making cautious appearances at community events. She didn't approach me directly, but I noticed her watching from a distance, her usual polish somewhat dimmed, her confidence replaced by something that looked like genuine reflection. At a September ice cream social, I observed her listening attentively to Esther Williams, the elderly woman who had nearly been forced to sell her home due to the HOA assessment, a small gesture of changed behavior that spoke volumes. The playground dedication was scheduled for early October, a date chosen to honor Harold's birthday. As the day approached, I found myself thinking more about what this moment represented. Not just a new community amenity, but a renewal of the spirit Harold and I had always cherished about Oak Ridge Commons. The evening before the dedication, I was surprised by another visitor, Beverly, carrying a small wrapped package. "The board wanted you to have this before tomorrow's ceremony," she explained as I invited her in. Inside the package was a beautiful bronze plaque, designed to be mounted at the playground entrance. It read, Patterson Playground Dedicated. To Harold Patterson, 1948-2024, whose vision of an inclusive community continues to inspire Oak Ridge Commons, and to Judith Patterson, who reminded us what community truly means. I ran my fingers over the raised lettering, emotion tightening my throat. It's perfect, I managed to say. Beverly squeezed my hand. We'll never forget what you did, Judith. Not just the donation, but the courage to stand up when it would have been easier to stay silent. After she left, I sat in Harold's study, the plaque on my lap, surrounded by his books and memories. I could almost hear his gentle laugh, feel his hand on my shoulder. Well, Harold, I whispered to the empty room, I think we've set things right. And somehow, in the quiet of that moment, I felt his approval wrap around me like a warm embrace. October 4th dawned clear and crisp, with just enough autumn chill to require a light sweater, but plenty of sunshine to warm the festivities. By 9 in the morning, the community park was buzzing with activity. Volunteers setting up chairs, caterers arranging refreshment tables, a small local band tuning their instruments on the stage where, months earlier, I had made my announcement that changed everything. The playground itself was magnificent, larger and more impressive than I had imagined when we began planning. Brightly colored climbing structures, swings designed to accommodate children of all abilities, sensory panels for those with developmental differences, and wide, smooth paths allowing wheelchair access throughout. At its center stood a magnificent treehouse structure with ramps and platforms at varying heights, offering challenge for older children while remaining accessible to those with mobility limitations. Amanda had flown in for the dedication, bringing her husband David and my grandchildren, Emma and Jack. As we walked toward the park together, Jack spotted the playground and broke into a run. Grandma, is that what you helped build? He called over his shoulder, his 8-year-old energy impossible to contain. It's what the whole community built together, I corrected gently as we followed his excited pace. But you started it, Emma said with the certainty of her 12 years. Mom told us how you stood up to the mean lady. I exchanged a glance with Amanda, who shrugged apologetically. Kids hear everything, she murmured. As we approached the gathering crowd, I was overwhelmed by the turnout. Nearly every resident of Oak Ridge Commons seemed to be present, from infants in strollers to seniors with walkers. Beverly spotted us and hurried over. Judith, everything looks wonderful, doesn't it? She embraced me warmly before turning to Amanda. Your mother is a local hero, you know. Amanda smiled. I'm learning that, though she was always my hero. The simple statement caught me off guard, bringing unexpected tears to my eyes. Amanda squeezed my hand, a wordless acknowledgement of emotions too complex for the moment. As we moved through the crowd, I was stopped repeatedly by neighbors offering thanks, congratulations, and in many cases apologies for not speaking up sooner against Melody's divisive leadership. I accepted each interaction graciously, increasingly aware of my role as a bridge between the community's past and its future. The formal ceremony was scheduled for 11 o'clock. As the time approached, Beverly guided me to a front row seat, with Amanda and her family beside me. On my other side, somewhat to my surprise, was an empty chair with a small, reserved sign. Just as Beverly stepped up to the microphone to begin the proceedings, I noticed movement at the edge of the gathering. Paul Carson was there, and beside him, looking uncharacteristically subdued in a simple blue dress, was Melody. Our eyes met across the crowd. After a moment's hesitation, Melody nodded slightly in my direction. Not quite a greeting, certainly not warmth, but an acknowledgement of my presence and perhaps, in some small way, my right to be celebrated today. Beverly welcomed everyone and briefly recounted the story of the playground's conception, tactfully avoiding direct mention of the confrontation at the potluck, but making clear that the community had undergone a significant transformation in recent months. Today, we dedicate not just a playground, but a renewed commitment to the values that make Oak Ridge Commons special, she said. Inclusivity, respect for all ages and abilities, transparency in governance, and above all, a spirit of true community. She invited several speakers to the microphone, the professional designer who explained the thoughtful elements incorporated into the playground, a representative from the Accessibility Coalition who praised the community's commitment to universal design, and Paul Carson, who spoke briefly but sincerely about the importance of creating spaces where all children could play together. Then Beverly called me to the stage. As I made my way up the steps, I felt a momentary flutter of nerves. Public speaking had never been my strong suit. That had been Harold's domain. But as I looked out at the gathered faces, I found my center again. When Harold and I moved to Oak Ridge Commons 43 years ago, I began, this park was little more than an empty field with a few young trees. On weekends, neighbors would gather informally, bringing blankets, sharing food, watching children run and play, while adults built the connections that would sustain us through life's challenges. I paused, letting my gaze move across familiar faces. George Henderson nodding in remembrance, the older residents smiling at the shared memory. Over the years, this community has evolved. We've added amenities, welcomed new neighbors, said goodbye to others. Change is inevitable and often valuable. But sometimes, in the process of change, we can lose sight of what matters most. My eyes found Melody in the crowd. She was listening intently, her expression unreadable. The true measure of a community isn't its property values or its amenities. It's how we care for each other. It's whether we create spaces where everyone belongs, the young and the old, the able-bodied and those with disabilities, longtime residents and newcomers. I gestured toward the playground behind me. This playground represents our commitment to those values. It's a place where no child is excluded, where parents and grandparents can engage actively rather than watch from the sidelines, where our community can come together across the boundaries that too often divide us. I took a deep breath, feeling emotion rise in my throat. Harold would have loved this. He believed deeply in creating spaces that bring people together rather than keep them apart. And, while I miss him every day, I feel his presence here today, in this gathering, in this renewed sense of community, in the laughter of children that will soon fill this playground. As I concluded my remarks, the applause was warm and genuine. Beverly returned to the microphone, inviting the youngest and oldest residents of Oak Ridge Commons to join her for the ribbon cutting. 4-month-old Lily, Chen in her mother's arms, and 93-year-old Walter Prescott with his walker, together symbolizing the community's commitment to all generations. As the ceremony transitioned to celebration, with food being served and children eagerly exploring the new playground despite parents' attempts to wait for the official opening, I found myself momentarily alone, watching the joyful chaos from a quiet corner. Mrs. Patterson? I turned to find Melody Carson standing behind me, her usual confidence noticeably absent. Melody, I acknowledged, keeping my expression neutral. She seemed to struggle for words, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her purse. I wanted to say, I waited, neither helping nor hindering her difficult task. I'm sorry, she finally managed, for how I treated you, for what I said at the potluck, for a lot of things. The apology was clearly difficult for her, the words coming out stiffly, unpracticed. Thank you, I said simply. Apology accepted. Relief flickered across her face, quickly replaced by uncertainty. I don't expect us to be friends, she added hastily. Perhaps not, I agreed, but we can be neighbors. Community members who treat each other with basic respect. She nodded, seeming to find the terms acceptable. After an awkward moment, she spoke again. Paul tells me the playground committee did amazing work. It really is impressive. Coming from Melody, this was high praise indeed. Many people contributed their ideas, I said. It was truly a community effort. Another pause, this one less tense than the first. Your cobbler, Melody said suddenly. At the potluck. It looked delicious. I couldn't help but smile at the unexpected comment. My mother's recipe. Perhaps I'll make it for the next community gathering. I'd like that, she replied, and for a brief moment, I glimpsed vulnerability beneath her carefully maintained facade. A woman who had built her identity around status and control, now, learning to exist in a community where different values prevailed. As Melody walked away, Amanda appeared at my side. Was that who I think it was? Yes, I confirmed. She apologized. Amanda's eyebrows shot up. Seriously? I'm impressed. That couldn't have been easy for someone like her. Change rarely is, I observed, but it's possible for anyone willing to try. We watched as Melody rejoined Paul near the refreshment table, where he was engaged in animated conversation with several parents about future community projects. You've created quite a legacy here, Mom, Amanda said, slipping her arm through mine. I shook my head. Not me. All of us together. That's what community is. Everyone contributing their gifts, their time, their care. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of conversations, laughter, and the delighted shrieks of children exploring their new playground. As the celebration began to wind down, I found myself sitting on a bench near the treehouse structure, watching my grandchildren navigate the climbing wall with newfound confidence. Beverly joined me, looking tired but deeply satisfied. "What a day," she sighed, sinking onto the bench beside me. "A good beginning," I agreed. She turned to me, her expression curious. "Beginning? Not end?" I smiled, gesturing toward the children playing, the adults chatting in small groups, the seniors watching contentedly from shaded seating areas. This was never about a playground, Beverly. It was about remembering who we are as a community, and that work is never finished. 3 months after the playground dedication, Oak Ridge Commons was transformed by the first heavy snowfall of the season. I stood at my living room window, watching fat flakes drift lazily from a pearl gray sky, blanketing the community in pristine white. The playground equipment was barely visible now, snow-covered lumps in the distance, but even in winter it remained a gathering place. Children building snowmen. Beside the slides, teenagers organizing impromptu snowball fights around the treehouse structure. The changes in our community had extended far beyond the physical space of the playground. Under Beverly's leadership, the HOA had been completely restructured, with transparent financial practices and rotating committee positions to prevent any single group from dominating decision-making. Monthly, town halls provided a forum for concerns to be aired and addressed. The community newsletter, once Melody's personal platform, was now edited by a committee representing diverse ages and interests. Most surprising of all had been the gradual transformation of Paul and Melody Carson. Paul had emerged from his wife's shadow to become a valued contributor to community projects, lending his professional expertise without seeking control or recognition. Melody's journey had been more complex. Her initial retreat following the potluck incident had gradually given way to cautious re-engagement, though on far different terms than before. I was pondering these changes when my doorbell rang. Opening the door, I found Melody standing on my porch, a covered dish in her gloved hands, snowflakes settling on her wool hat. "Good morning, Judith," she said, her breath clouding in the cold air. "I'm delivering invitations to the winter solstice gathering next week, and I brought you this." She handed me the dish. "It's peach cobbler, not from a mix," she added hastily. I asked Beverly for your mother's recipe. I've been practicing." The gesture left me momentarily speechless. This small offering represented something significant for a woman who had once publicly humiliated me over the same dessert. "Thank you, Melody," I said finally, accepting the dish. "Would you like to come in for tea? It's quite cold out there." She hesitated, clearly not having anticipated the invitation. "I have several more deliveries to make, but yes, tea would be nice." I led her into the living room where a fire crackled in the hearth, one of the few home maintenance tasks I'd mastered since Harold's passing. As I prepared a tray in the kitchen, I could hear Melody moving around, looking at the photographs on the mantel, the bookshelves Harold had built decades ago. When I returned with the tea, she was studying a photo of Harold and me from our early days in Oak Ridge Commons, standing proudly in front of our newly built home. "You've been here from the beginning," she said, accepting the cup I offered. "Sometimes I forget that." "Since 1981, I confirmed, settling into my armchair. "When the developer was still putting in roads and most of these trees were just saplings." Melody sat on the edge of the sofa, cradling her teacup with a tentativeness I'd never associated with her. "I've been thinking a lot about community, what it means, how to build it, how to be part of it without trying to control it." "That's quite a shift in perspective," I observed. She nodded, a rueful smile crossing her face. "My therapist says I've made progress." She paused, then added more softly, "I'm sorry it took such a public humiliation for me to recognize my behavior." "Sometimes we need dramatic moments to see ourselves clearly," I said, thinking of my own journey from isolation back to community engagement. "When we first moved here," Melody continued, "I was determined to make my mark. In our previous neighborhood, I was always on the outside of the social circles, never quite accepted. I promised myself it would be different here. So you created your own circle and kept others out," I said, understanding dawning. "Exactly," she sighed. "The irony is I recreated the very dynamic I'd resented, just from the other side." She looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "I was especially threatened by you, you know?" "Me?" I couldn't hide my surprise. "Why? You had everything I wanted. respect that wasn't forced, influence that came naturally, deep roots in the community. You didn't have to try so hard. Everyone already valued your opinion, your presence. The perception was so at odds with how I'd felt during my months of grief and isolation that I nearly laughed. I felt invisible, Melody, especially after Harold died. You were never invisible, she said firmly. Even when you withdrew, people still spoke of you with respect. Judith would, no, they'd say, or, I wonder what Judith thinks about this. It drove me crazy. We sat in silence for a moment, the fire popping occasionally, snow continuing to fall outside the window. Two women at different stages of life, with different approaches to the world, finding unexpected common ground. The winter solstice gathering, Melody said eventually, returning to her original purpose. It was Beverly's idea to revive the old tradition. She said you and Harold used to host it years ago? I nodded, memories washing over me. For about 20 years. Simple but meaningful. Candles, music, neighbors sharing hopes for the coming year. We stopped when Harold got sick. We'd like you to light the first candle this year, Melody said, as the keeper of the tradition. The invitation touched me deeply. I'd be honored. As she prepared to leave, Melody paused at the door. Your cobbler recipe. It really is exceptional. Harold had good taste. I smiled. In cobbler and in community. After she left, I stood again at the window, watching her careful progress through the snow, delivering invitations to each home. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Melody Carson, once the self-appointed gatekeeper of community inclusion, now personally inviting every household to participate. The winter solstice gathering, held in the community center on the longest night of the year, exceeded all expectations. Nearly every resident attended, from infants to seniors, the large room glowing with candlelight and warmed by shared food and conversation. When Beverly called for attention and invited me to light the first candle, I moved to the center of the room where a large pillar candle waited. In darkness, we find the value of light, I said, repeating the words Harold had always used. In winter, we remember that spring will come again. In community, we never face the darkness alone. I lit the candle, its flame steady and bright, then turned to pass the light to Beverly, who passed it to another neighbor, and another, until the room was illuminated by dozens of small flames, a visual representation of how community grows, one connection at a time. Later that evening, as I prepared to leave, Paul Carson approached me, Melody at his side. We have something to tell you, he said, a hint of excitement in his voice. We've been working with the board on a new initiative, the Harold Patterson Community Scholarship. It's for local students pursuing degrees in education, library science, or community development, Melody added, fields that build and strengthen communities. We've already secured funding for the first 5 years, Paul continued. The first awards will be presented next spring. I was deeply moved by their initiative, recognizing it as a meaningful form of restitution, not just to me, but to the community as a whole. Harold would be honored, I said simply. Education and community were his life's work. As I walked home through the snow-covered neighborhood, lights glowing from windows, occasional laughter drifting through the cold air, I felt Harold's presence keenly, not as a ghost or spiritual visitation, but as a continuation of values, a legacy lived out in concrete ways. The cobbler and the microphone had been catalysts, but the real story was larger than my moment of standing up or Melody's public humiliation. It was about a community remembering its core values, recognizing when it had strayed, and finding its way back to a more inclusive, transparent, and supportive vision. And in that journey, I had found my own way forward without Harold, not by leaving behind our shared past, but by carrying its best parts into a new chapter. Spring came early to Oak Ridge Commons the following year. By mid-March, crocuses were pushing through the soil in my garden, and the cherry trees lining the community entrance burst into glorious pink bloom seemingly overnight. I was kneeling in the backyard, clearing winter debris from Harold's vegetable garden, now truly my vegetable garden, when I heard the distinctive sound of Amanda's voice calling from the front yard. Mom, where are you hiding? In the back, I called, peeling off my gardening gloves as I stood. Amanda appeared around the side of the house, a broad smile on her face and an envelope in her hand. I have news, she announced, waving the envelope. Big news. I ushered her inside, made tea, our family's response to all significant moments, and waited expectantly at the kitchen table. David's been offered a position at Westfield University, she said, barely containing her excitement. Full professorship, heading the environmental science department. That's wonderful, I exclaimed, knowing how hard my son-in-law had worked for such an opportunity. But isn't Westfield exactly 20 minutes from here? Amanda finished, her eyes sparkling. We're moving back, Mom. All of us. Emma, Jack, the whole family. The news hit me with unexpected force. Joy mingled with a wave of emotion I couldn't immediately identify. My daughter and her family, returning after 15 years on the West Coast. My grandchildren, growing up, nearby rather than through occasional visits and video calls. When? I managed to ask. July. The kids will finish the school year in Seattle, and then we'll make the move. We've already started house hunting. She reached across the table to take my hand. How do you feel about having us close again? Overjoyed, I said truthfully. But also concerned that you might be doing this out of worry for me. I'm managing well on my own, you know. Amanda laughed. Oh, Mom, you're doing more than managing. You're thriving. This decision isn't about taking care of you. It's about our family being part of the community you've helped rebuild. David and I have been talking about it since the playground dedication. Over the following weeks, Amanda and David's plans took concrete shape. They found a lovely home just 6 blocks from mine, close enough for frequent visits but far enough to maintain independence. Emma and Jack were excited about the move, especially the prospect of being near the playground their grandmother had helped create. As spring progressed into early summer, the community continued to evolve in positive ways. The senior-friendly garden spaces were completed, with raised beds at perfect heights for those who couldn't bend easily and smooth paths for walkers and wheelchairs. Every Saturday morning, gardeners of all ages gathered to plant, weed, and harvest together. The community library corner in the clubhouse had become a beloved feature, with residents donating books and volunteering time to keep it organized. I spent Tuesday afternoons there, reading to children after school, a continuation of my librarian days that brought me deep satisfaction. In May, the first Harold Patterson Community Scholarships were awarded to 3 local students: a young woman pursuing library science, a young man studying urban planning with a focus on inclusive design, and a returning adult student working toward a teaching degree while raising her children alone. The award ceremony, held in the community center, was attended by nearly every resident. As I presented the certificates, I couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in a single year. The divisions Melody had fostered had given way to a genuine spirit of inclusion. The financial irregularities that had burdened residents had been corrected through transparent processes. The amenities now served the entire community rather than a select few. After the ceremony, Beverly joined me for a walk through the neighborhood. The board has been discussing something we'd like your input on, she said as we strolled past homes with flourishing front gardens. We're thinking of creating a permanent position, community historian and elder liaison. That sounds oddly specific, I remarked, giving her a sidelong glance. Beverly laughed. It is rather tailored to a certain recently retired librarian who knows more about this community than anyone else. Me? Beverly, I'm 73 years old. Exactly. You have perspective, institutional memory, connections across generations. We need that as we continue to grow and change. I considered the proposal as we walked, appreciating the recognition, but wary of formalized responsibility at this stage of life. What would this position actually entail? I asked finally. Whatever you make of it, Beverly replied. Documentation of community history, perhaps. Advocacy for senior residents, mentoring younger families. A small stipend would be attached, but it's more about recognizing the value of your role here. Let me think about it, I said, though I was already intrigued by the possibilities. We had reached the playground, now lush with new landscaping around the play structures. Children of various ages scrambled over the equipment, parents and grandparents watching from benches designed for comfort and accessibility. Among them, I spotted Melody, sitting somewhat apart but clearly present in the community space. She's still finding her way, Beverly commented, following my gaze. But she's trying. That counts for something. It counts for a great deal, I agreed. The annual community potluck was scheduled for mid-June, almost exactly 1 year after the confrontation that had catalyzed so much change. As the date approached, I found myself reflecting on that moment, standing with my peach cobbler as Melody's cruel words silenced the gathering, the walk to the microphone that had required more courage than I knew I possessed. The morning of the potluck dawned sunny and mild, perfect weather for an outdoor gathering. I prepared my mother's peach cobbler with practiced hands, the familiar motions connecting me to generations of women in my family who had created this simple dessert to share with those they loved. As I worked, I spoke occasionally to Harold's photograph on the kitchen windowsill, a habit I'd developed over the past year, not out of grief or delusion, but as a way of processing my thoughts. "It's come full circle, Harold," I said, arranging peach slices in the baking dish. "1 year ago today, everything changed. Not just for me, but for all of Oak Ridge Commons." I could almost hear his gentle response. "Not changed, Judy. Renewed. Returned to what it was meant to be all along." Amanda and her family arrived mid-morning to help with final preparations. Together, we walked to the park, where tables had been arranged in a large circle, rather than the separate clusters Melody had once insisted upon. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. No head, table, no hierarchy, just community members gathered as equals. Beverly spotted us immediately and hurried over, embracing me warmly before leading us to a table where my name card had been placed beside Amanda's family. "We have a surprise for you," Beverly said mysteriously. During the announcements, the potluck unfolded in an atmosphere of genuine warmth and inclusion. Children darted between tables, seniors were escorted to shaded seating, newcomers were introduced and welcomed. I watched it all with quiet satisfaction, occasionally catching Amanda's knowing smile. When it came time for announcements, Beverly approached the microphone, the same microphone I had used a year earlier to change the course of our community. "Before we begin formal announcements," she said, "we have a special presentation. Judith Patterson, would you please join me?" Puzzled but curious, I made my way to the stage. Beverly gestured for me to stand beside her as she continued. "1 year ago today, Judith reminded us what community truly means. Through her courage, generosity, and wisdom, she catalyzed changes that have made Oak Ridge Commons stronger, more inclusive, and more transparent." She turned to face me directly. "Today, by unanimous vote of the community board and with the support of residents, we are renaming our community center the Judith and Harold Patterson Community Center in recognition of your lifetime of service and the values you have championed." She unveiled a small model of the building with a new sign bearing our names. The gathering erupted in applause, many people rising to their feet in a standing ovation that left me blinking back tears. When the applause finally subsided, Beverly handed me the microphone. I took a moment to compose myself before speaking. "Thank you all for this extraordinary honor," I began. "Harold and I moved to Oak Ridge Commons because we believed in the vision of a true community. Not just houses sharing proximity, but people sharing lives, supporting one another through challenges, celebrating together in good times." I looked out at the gathered faces, familiar neighbors I'd known for decades, newcomers I was just getting to know, my daughter and her family who would soon be part of this community again. Community isn't something we achieve once and then preserve unchanged. It's something we create anew each day, through small kindnesses, through speaking up when values are threatened, through welcoming new voices while honoring those with experience. My eyes found Melody in the crowd. She sat with Paul, listening attentively, no longer the domineering force she had once been, but still present, still part of the fabric we were weaving together. A year ago, I stood at this microphone feeling isolated and hurt. Today, I stand here surrounded by connection and hope. That transformation wasn't my doing alone. It required all of us choosing to remember and recommit to what makes community meaningful. I smiled, feeling Harold's presence strongly in that moment. The truest measure of community isn't found in property values or amenities. It's found in how we treat each other, especially those who might be vulnerable or overlooked. It's found in our willingness to listen to diverse perspectives, to share power rather than hoard it, to create spaces where everyone belongs. I gestured toward the playground visible in the distance, the garden spaces beginning to flourish with summer plantings, the tables where we gathered to share food and conversation. This is Oak Ridge Commons at its best. Not perfect, still evolving, but grounded in values that will sustain us through whatever challenges come next. Thank you for allowing Harold and me to be part of this journey, and thank you for this honor, which I accept on behalf of everyone who has contributed to making our community a place where all can thrive. As I returned to my seat amid renewed applause, Amanda squeezed my hand, her eyes shining with pride. "You know what Dad would say right now?" she whispered. I nodded, smiling through my tears. that the best revenge is living well and bringing others along with you. After the formal presentations concluded, people lingered at tables, sharing desserts and conversation. I was making my way toward the beverage station when Melody approached, carrying 2 plates of cobbler. One slice of hers, one of mine. "I thought we should compare notes," she said, offering me the plate with her creation. Professional courtesy. I accepted it with a smile, recognizing the gesture for what it was. Not friendship exactly, but a kind of truce, an acknowledgement that we could coexist in this community with mutual respect, if not intimate connection. We stood side by side, tasting each other's handiwork. "Yours is better," Melody admitted after a thoughtful bite. "What's the secret?" "Patience," I replied. "You can't rush good cobbler. You have to let the fruit speak for itself." She nodded, understanding that we were talking about more than dessert. As the afternoon waned and people began drifting homeward, I found myself sitting alone for a moment at a table near the edge of the gathering. From this vantage point, I could see the entire community in microcosm. Children playing, adults conversing, seniors sharing stories, all within the embrace of the neighborhood we called home. Amanda found me there, sliding into the chair beside me. "Penny for your thoughts, Mom." I smiled, watching a butterfly dance among the flowers bordering the park. "I was just thinking about how things come full circle. A year ago, I stood in this park feeling humiliated and isolated. Today you're the heart of this community," Amanda finished. "Not the heart," I corrected gently. "Just one thread in the tapestry. But it's a beautiful tapestry, isn't it?" We sat in comfortable silence, mother and daughter, watching the community Harold and I had helped found continue to evolve and flourish around us. Everyone thought I was just a nosy old bat with a pie in my hands that day. But what they didn't see was the woman who had built libraries from nothing, raised a daughter through hardship, and eventually helped rebuild a community from silence. The sweetest victory, I've learned, isn't served with revenge, but with peach cobbler and an open heart, creating space for everyone at the table, even those who once tried to turn you away.